Welcome to the third and final part of our lecture series covering material related to the last half of Chapter 13 of Wolfe and Colleagues 2019. Chapter 13 is Touch and Haptic Perception, and in Part 3 we'll be talking about haptic perception, or how we know where we are in space through our sense of touch, and how we move around our world and interact with the world through our sense of touch. Haptic perception. So part 3 of our lecture series on touch and haptic perception is indeed haptic perception. Haptic perception is the knowledge of the world that we derive from sensory receptors in the skin, muscles, tendons, and joints, and usually involves active exploration. For instance, aligning the arrows and opening a child-proof aspirin bottle in the dark would be an example of haptic perception in action. And so understanding the directionality of the arrows and aligning them without visual input, only through the sense of touch, is going to be an example of haptic perception. So haptic perception is perception for action, which is using somatosensation to grasp and manipulate objects in a stable and coordinated manner, and to maintain proper posture and balance is all a part of haptic perception as well. Now in this figure we have the forces involved in force and position during grasping, lifting, and releasing a cube. So you can imagine yourself reaching for, grabbing hold of a cube on a table, lifting it off the table, moving it, say an arm's width, and then putting it back on the table and then releasing it again. That's exactly what we have here, and we have load force in newtons in the upper graph, and that's the red line there. Then in the next graph, we have the grip force as imposed by the fingers pinching the cube. That's the blue line. Then the green line represents position, and this is the height relative to the table. And then the next one down at the very bottom is the grip force as a function of load force. So grip force over load force. And so this is the ratio of grip force to load force, and it's set so as to just prevent the cube from slipping as we're holding it. And then after putting it back down and then releasing it, that's where we see it go beyond that slip threshold. Now let me explain what we've got here in terms of the different tasks that we're doing, different things that we're doing. So in figure A, in portion A of this particular figure right here, what we're doing is grasping the cube. So in figure A, in segment A, we're grasping the cube. And then in segment B and C, we're actually lifting the cube. So in all of these different graphs, that's what's going on. And so we can see what happens with load force, grip force, position, and the ratio of grip force to load force when we're grasping the cube or lifting the cube. And then D and E represent those segments represent holding the cube, and then F and G represent releasing the cube. So that's what we do when we release the cube. And so what we can see is when we're grasping the cube, the load force is non-existent because we haven't actually lifted the cube off the table. The grip force, though, is increasing steadily as we lift the cube. So in lifting the cube, which again is B and C, we see great grip force increasing, and staying up, we see the position gradually lifting in C, the last part of C, as we actually lift the cube, and then the grip force over load force is staying constant from the middle of B all the way out to segment G when we actually release the cube. Then in D and E, remember D and E is actually moving the cube and holding it up while we're moving it. You can see a constant load force and a constant grip force. And then when we reach F and G, which is releasing the cube, we can see a decrease in grip force and load force as we release the cube. So that's when we've put the cube back down on the table, and that's exactly where it passes that slip threshold, is when we've put it on the table and release our grip and no longer hold it at all. That's the slip threshold. So you can see there, load force, grip force, position, and grip force as a function of load force as we lift a cube. And you can see the forces increase as we lift the cube off the table, as we grasp the cube and then lift it off of the table, and then holding it up is what we're going to be doing, and that's where we have the maximum force in both load force and grip force, and the position as well. That's where we have the highest position, is at that point as well. So those are the things that we're doing as we lift a cube. And so action for perception, part of haptic perception, we're using our hands to actively explore the world of surfaces and objects outside of our bodies. The exploratory procedure, there is a stereotypical hand movement pattern used to contact objects in order to perceive their properties. Each exploratory procedure is best to determine one or more object properties. So we use a lateral movement where we move our hands laterally across the stimulus or across the surface to determine roughness, for instance. And researchers have looked at this, including Lederman and Klatsky in a paper published in 1987, where they describe for us some of these properties. And so texture, roughness, lateral motion across this hockey puck that they're holding in the upper left-hand corner. Pressure is going to determine hardness. If you're thinking of a hockey puck here, he will not be able to indent the hockey puck, and that will indicate hardness. If it's a lot softer, then he'll indicate that by pressure moving that stimulus, and so that's going to indicate hardness. Static contact is going to indicate temperature. Imagine holding your fingers on a stove that you've turned off some time ago, that you're trying to make sure it's not hot any longer. Unsupported holding, that's how we determine weight. And enclosure is global shape or volume. So when we reach our hand out and then softly touch the stimulus by closing our fingers on it, that's how we determine global shape or volume. And then contour following, where we move our hands along the contour of a stimulus, gives us an indication of global shape and exact shape. So that's how we determine the exact shape. So let's think back to the example I gave earlier of exploring and finding the keys in my bag. And without looking at the stimuli in my bag, I might use lateral motion to find the cloth band that holds the keys together. And that's what I would use. I would also use texture from the band itself to determine that that's the band. I might use pressure to determine that I've reached a metal key. I might use also temperature to understand that I've reached a cold metal key in my bag. Won't necessarily use weight, but I might explore and make sure that I've got the rough edge of the key and that it's not something else in my bag to determine that I've reached a key, found a key, and then I can pull it out. These are all haptic explorations that I can do in order to understand what I am encountering without vision, and that's with the sense of touch only. Now, fingerprints are understood to have a particular function in perception and action. The ridged fingerprint pattern aids perception of fine surface textures. The fingerprints in particular, the fingerprint ridges selectively amplify frequencies from 200 to 300 hertz by about a factor of 100 while filtering out other frequencies, and this fits with the sensitivity range of the FA2 receptors. So they're going to give you a benefit if you're starting to feel slippage and starting to feel that the object is slipping out of your hand. Your FA2 receptors are going to help you determine that. Um, Remember, FA2 are fast adapting, but they're deeper, the Pacinian corpuscles, deeper in the skin, and they're going to be picking up that vibration. So they're going to help maintain grip in the presence of moisture by amplifying those signals and help you realize that something is slipping out of your fingers and allow you to grasp it tighter so it doesn't slip. And so here's an electron microscope picture of the ridges on the human index finger pad. And so you can see there, and again, those Pacinian corpuscles are what's going to be detecting those vibrations in the figures as the item in your fingers start to slip and stimulate the vibration, amplify the vibration. The ridges are going to amplify those vibrations and stimulate those Pacinian corpuscles, which are going to help you hold on to that and avoid the item from slipping, help you keep it in your grip rather than letting it slip through your fingers. There is a what system of touch, which is the geometric properties of objects, and we tend to associate those as very important for visual recognition. The material properties of objects are crucial for haptic recognition. And so two-dimensional pictures of objects are recognized easily visually but poorly haptically. We basically don't get any information from a picture of an object. That's only visually perceived. But you can get the haptic information from the objects, the real objects that are there in front of you. And those are the things that will help you identify it, are the what system of touch. Now, the question is, haptic search, is it similar to visual search? And if we're trying to recognize the presence of material properties that are presented haptically to the fingers with a special device, then we can ask the question, is the haptic search similar to visual search in that do we have some material properties that pop out? If we were to have those in the visual modality, what would pop out? How would we know something is popped out? Something is processed pre-attentively? Well, we would see no change as the number of distractors increases. We would see no change in the time it took to find the target. And we would see no difference between the slope of the change when we add more distractors between target present and target absent. Basically, with pop out, that means that the object basically jumps up and down and says, "Here I am." So regardless of the number of distractors that are there, you easily find it. And so researchers have looked to see if we demonstrate such pop out with haptic exploration and haptic search for material properties. And this is a device that was used by Lederman and Klatsky in a paper published in 1997. And then Pleiser, Bergman, Teist, and Kappers in a paper published in 2009 used these particular objects down below. So in the Lederman and Klatsky, what would happen is these stimuli under the fingertips would rotate and reveal new objects, new textures, and then the individual would identify whether the target was present or absent in the display of the textures. Here in Pleiser and colleagues' study, they would basically give the objects to the individual. They were suspended in air there. The individual would reach up and grasp the objects and identify if the target is present amongst those distractors. And then the question is, what happens as we increase the number of distractors? Obviously here, with the Lederman and Klatsky study, there's a limit to how many we can include in that display. In the Pleiser and colleagues 2009 study, we can include more targets, more distractors, and then the individual can identify if there's a target present or not. And here we have some of the example data from Lederman and Klatsky's 1997 paper. So remember, they've presented stimuli directly under the fingertips, three on the left hand and 3 on the right hand, so up to 6 stimuli. And that's what we have on the x-axis here is the number of figures stimulated. And then across the y-axis, we have response time. And in this particular case, it's smooth versus rough. So the target might be smooth and the distractors are all rough, up to 6 different stimuli. And if the search were what would be known as a conjunction search in the visual search modality, in the visual search paradigm, or at least something that requires attentive processing is another way of saying it, we would expect to see a slope greater than 0 for both the target present and target absent lines. And then we would expect to see the target present being completed in about with a slope that's half the slope for the target absent. So you would expect to see a significant increase in target absent response time, significantly faster than the target present. And we don't see that here. And indeed, this is an example of those stimuli that pop out. And so it doesn't matter how many targets you have, how many distractors you have, you see no difference in reaction time. That's the target present slope of -1 up above. Now the ones where you would expect to see the differences and the slowing with the greater number of stimuli, they did find some in this particular paper that were like that. They tended to be location of spatial characteristics of the stimuli. That was one of those things that definitely took attention and attentive search. And they listed a number of those things in the paper. And that's what I have here. Some indication of the material properties that pop out: rough among smooth, hard among soft, cool among warm, edges among smooth surfaces. Properties that do not pop out: horizontal lines among vertical lines, left versus right. So they had pictures of a hole, and then on either the left or the right side, they had another hole that you would have to find and indicate whether it was on the left or the right of that center hole. And those did not pop out at you. And some of the ones like the horizontal lines among vertical lines that do not pop out in the haptic perception, in the haptic search. Those same stimuli do pop out in the visual search paradigm. So these researchers concluded that pop-out stimuli for vision and touch, while there are pop-out stimuli for vision and touch that might be similar, they're not all exactly the same. And some things that might pop out for vision do not pop out for haptic search. So some differences exist between vision and touch in terms of search processes. When we look at how people are perceiving patterns with the skin, the Braille alphabet is one example of where this is used and allows us to look at how well people perceive uh, touch stimuli. So Loomis in 1990 proposed that touch acts like blurred vision when the fingertips explore a raised pattern. Visual stimuli blurred to match the acuity of fingertip skin. Visual stimuli and haptic stimuli showed same confusion errors. So when the visual stimuli was blurred to match the perception of the fingertip skin, then we show similar confusion errors in that particular task. And basically it looks like they're very similar to each other, with the acuity of the fingertips being similar to acuity in blurred vision. Here is some of the characters used by Loomis in his study of Braille. Um, you can see here the different uh, characteristics that might be used. And just as in vision, we can also consider a where system of touch, knowing where objects are in the environment using only touch perception is what we would be interested in knowing about in the where system. And the example might be finding the snooze button on an alarm clock in the morning. Uh, and you know basically where that is. Um, Sometimes lying in bed, you might reach over and grab something off of your bedside table in the dark, and basically that's where you're using your where system of touch and proprioception to find your glasses, for instance, maybe on the bedside table or something like that. Uh, and in these situations, we use a frame of reference where we're using a coordinate system used to define locations in space. And we also use an ego center uh, where we're using usually ourselves and our central location as a frame of reference frame to use to represent locations relative to our own bodies. So that's what we're going to be doing when we use the where system of touch. And here's an example of a particular where system of touch um, task. And the person is asked to match the hole that the stimulus is going into on top with the location underneath. And when blindfolded or the eyes are closed so that you can't do a visual search, and uh, it tends to be somewhat of a challenging task. Here is another example. This is Capers, after Capers 2007. Again, the woman is blindfolded, and then she's given a stimulus with one hand and an orientation that she's supposed to match with the other hand. And you can see here there's various places where that can happen. And so she's asked to match the two stimuli. And that's again that where and finding that egocentric location of the body. Another study looked at tactile spatial attention. This was a study by Spence, Pavini, and Driver. Uh, They used a spatial cueing paradigm to test the integration of visual and tactile modalities. An arrow would be lighted up to indicate which hand might receive a vibration, and then the vibration could be a pulse or a sustained force, and the task was to identify which occurred. So this is basically so this is similar to a spatial cueing paradigm that researchers like Posner used in research in the visual modality. And it's that covert attention and trying to see if you can focus your attention on a particular spatial location, in this case in the tactile modality, and identify more quickly a primed or a cued location than an uncued location. And then you can also vary whether the cue is uh, congruent with the task. It gives correct information or incorrect information, and see if that makes a difference in the visual modality or in the tactile modality as it does in the visual modality. So here's where we have that covert attentional cueing task, and there's a cue light that points either to the left or to the right, and the cue can be accurate. It points to the place where the target is going to show up, or it can be inaccurate and point to the location that's opposite to where it needs to be. And then the question is, does that influence haptic perception and haptic attention in the same way that it does with the visual modality? And so the cues mostly were valid cues, some were invalid, and sure enough, participants were faster with the valid cues and slower with the invalid cues. Uh, and so focusing one's attention on a particular location with a cue, causing someone to focus their attention on a particular location, definitely changed the reaction time. And so uh, they were faster when the cue was valid than when it was invalid. And then Spence, Nichols, and Driver, in a study published in 2001, performed a cross-modal version of that same study. And Spence, Nichols, and Driver led participants to expect a stimulus to be presented in one modality, and sometimes it was presented in another modality. So they could have the stimuli being in the visual modality or in the tactile modality sometimes. And so presenting your attention to one modality, does that interfere with your ability to attend to the other modality? And the greatest costs were for invalid cues that occurred when tactile stimulus was expected, but a visual or auditory stimulus was presented instead. So that implies that the sense of touch may have a very restricted attentional channel. So it appears that you can either covertly focus your attention on the tactile modality, the touch modality, but you can't spread your attention across both the tactile or the touch modality and the auditory or visual modality. You can do that maybe a little bit better in the spread your attention across the visual and auditory modalities. Those don't seem to restrict each other as much, but when it comes to touch, once you've attended to the touch system, it's much harder to switch and pick up signals from the other channels. So sense of touch may have a very restricted attentional channel, is what that's saying. And then Pavini, Spence, and Driver, in a study published in 2000, used a vibrotactile identification task. And participants felt vibration on either the thumb or forefinger of the left or right hand. And then they identified the location of vibration as quickly as possible with foot control. And the participants could not see their hands. So the light was presented at the same time as the vibrations in two conditions, congruent with the target at the same location as the vibration, or incongruent with the target at different location from vibration. So it's the same sort of setup. But what they've done here that's interesting is they are going to introduce some dummy hands, some hands that aren't really their hands. They won't, here you can see in this picture, somebody sitting there with his hands on these boxes that he cannot see, and there's a light that comes on that indicates which hand he's going to be receiving the stimulus in, or not. And then the question is, can he divert the attention, can he direct attention to that location when he can't see it with his eyes? And then what they're going to do is they're going to add some rubber hands on top, and they're either oriented the same way as his real hands or differently. And then the question is, what happens with rubber hands that are not actually attached to his body? So in experiment 1, these rubber hands were in the same orientation as the participants' hands. And experiment 2, they were in a different orientation as the participants' hands. So here you can see they're in the same orientation, and then the lights are going to be showing up on these boxes on top, and the reaction is going to be, the stimulus is going to be felt by the fingers of his actual hands. And here the rubber hands are in the same location as his hands. And then in this one, the hands are located different from his own hands. They're not in the same location. And then the big question is, would these synthetic, these artificial hands and their orientation influence the person's responses and their reactions when the stimulus is expected in one particular location based on the light that shows up? And so would these differently oriented hands make it harder for him to do the task and disrupt his attentional location, the location of his attention? In this slide, we have the results from experiment 1 of Pavini, Spence, and Driver, published in 2000. And so what we have in the graph is the reaction time difference. On the y-axis is the mean congruency effect in milliseconds. So that's the difference in reaction time between the congruent and the incongruent conditions. And so, and then the black bars represent the condition where the rubber hands are present and aligned. Remember, experiment 1, they're only aligned. And or the white bars are the rubber hands are absent. And then we can see the effects in terms of congruency effect by the size of the bar. And then we have the uh, error rate in terms of the error rate in the percentage above each of those. So if we're looking just at reaction times, we see the biggest difference between congruent and incongruent in the rubber hand condition, with it appearing on the same side. And we see the less of a difference between the congruent and incongruent on the opposite side. And the hands absent also results in less of a difference. These are significant differences, as I recall, between in the same condition for sure, in the same condition, the rubber hands resulted in a significant increase in the size of the congruency effect compared to the hands absent. And then when we look at experiment 2 results, and that's what we have here, Now remember, in the experiment 2, the rubber hands were present but misaligned, so that they did not correspond to the participant's own hands. There we see no difference in the congruency effect between the rubber hands absent and the rubber hands present. So here the effect did not make a difference. The rubber hands did not make a difference here because they were misaligned. Here there's no difference between the condition, the congruency effect for the rubber hands present versus the rubber hands absent. So that's what we have here. And what we can see then is the reaction time is the difference, the benefit or the congruency effect is about 75 to 80%, 80 milliseconds. But there's no difference between the congruency effect for the rubber hands present or the rubber hands absent. So Pavini, Spence, and Driver concluded that participants appeared to mislocalize the vibrotactile stimuli towards the rubber hands on the same side as the stimulus when it was aligned with the real hand. So vision captured an overwhelmed proprioception is what they concluded, that when the hands were aligned in a way that they could be their own hands, they would misalign that to it, mislocalize that to it, and then indicate that they would indeed show the largest congruency effect with the rubber hands present in experiment 1. Experiment 2 showed that if they could not do that because of the misaligned hands, they were less likely to do that. And that leads us to the rubber hand illusion, which you should go and watch. It's a lot of fun. What you'll see in this particular example is the fact that as you stroke, if you have the situation similar to what Pavini and Spence and Driver had in their studies, where the individual can see the rubber hands and then you touch their real hand with a brush at the same time they see you stroking the rubber hand, you will perceive the rubber hand as your real hand with enough time of this stroking back and forth. And so it's a lot of fun to watch, a very interesting illusion where this happens. And clearly we are misattributing information, the being overwhelmed with the visual information we're getting that corresponds to the tactile information we're receiving. And then it's a lot of fun to see what happens when somebody experiences something that might hurt that rubber hand. They show a similar reaction to what they would if somebody were to really hurt their real hand. So it's a fun, interesting illusion, a tactile or haptic illusion that you can watch on YouTube. There are other very good examples of this as well, other than just this one. I will link to that in our Blackboard segment so that you can link to it and watch that as well. Lederman, Thorne, and Jones in 1986 also showed participants one type of sandpaper while they touched a different type, but they told them they were the same and then asked them how closely packed are the elements on the surface. And when they asked that particular question, how closely packed are the elements on the surface, they were more influenced by vision. When asked how rough is the surface, something that would be more of a tactile experience, they were more influenced by touch. So what you're asking and the specific information you're seeking will influence as well what sort of response you get and what they're going to attend to most. So obviously when you ask a question that looks like you're asking about visual processing, you're going to get an answer that might reflect the vision modality. Whereas if you're asking a question about the surface texture, which might be more of a tactile experience, you'll get more influence from touch. And that's all that I have for you for our lectures on this particular chapter, chapter 13, and the last half in particular of chapter 13 of your textbook. Uh, we'll move on to chapter 14 next, and then we'll also do chapter 15 in the next week as well. So chapters 14 and 15 are still to come, and I hope you will look forward to joining me with that too. I will hope you are doing well and can enjoy this last couple of weeks of our class.